two from Councillor David Jenkins and Matthew Jones. Have we any others from anyone?
No further apologies, Chair.
Okay, right. Item 2 is disclosures of personal prejudicial interest, which is the normal one. Members? No? Any officers? Okay. Then item 3 is the prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips. For explanation for our visitors, this is on the this is on every agenda. It is obviously to disclose the fact that this is not a political meeting. This is a fact-finding meeting. This is a scrutiny panel, and as a result, there is a prohibition of whip votes on this particular panel and all the scrutiny. Okay, then we go on to item 4, which is the minutes of the previous meeting, which I'm sure everybody has read very diligently. Okay, I'll go through them page by page. Page 1, page 2, page 3. On page 3, we've asked a number of questions on the recycling and landfill, which we sent out on the letter, which we hope to have an answer for shortly. And finally, on page 4. Okay, any questions on that? All agreed? Then we move on to item 5, which is public questions. We have none on this particular meeting. Oh, Robinson. And then we go on to the budget proposals, which is item 6 on the agenda. And can I welcome the leader who is online, if you would like to say a few words before we ask Mr. Ben Smith to go through the actual paperwork.
Thank you, Chair. I'll let Mr. Smith do his technical first, and then obviously I'll come in later if you need me to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, Mr. Ben Smith.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Leader. I'll be as brief as I can in terms of focusing on the technicals. I'm sure there will be a number of questions. It goes without saying that this is another year where the settlement was late in the day from Welsh Government because there was a late autumn budget statement. And I have again certified, as I did last year, the report is urgent, and it went to Cabinet last week. For those that didn't see the transcript of Cabinet, I did have to advise Cabinet that there were very minor changes to revenue support grant, slightly bigger changes to the basic capital allocation. And I'm also aware since last night that there are 2 further changes from Welsh Government. So we're up to 4 technical changes already. They don't materially change the position in terms of the report that Cabinet agreed as the basis for consultation, but I think it is indicative of the pressure that ministers and officials are under at Welsh Government level, and I'm sure the same will be true for ourselves when it comes to working through what are going to be challenging budget proposals. Whilst the settlement was not surprising in terms of the planning assumptions we had been making in recent weeks, frankly, it didn't work particularly well rushing to get it out a day after the settlement last year, so we deferred it to early January, and pretty much I think every council in Wales has done the same. Many met a week before us, many met the same week as us, and some next week. I would want to recognise and reflect on the candour and discipline provided by all chief officers and cabinet members in working up options. There is a danger that everyone can say it's all too difficult and impossible. These are not pleasant proposals, and I'm sure there will be questions, and the leader may well want to comment on some of the politics of it. But the reality is we have to set a balanced budget, and the proposals before you do set out as inoffensive a way as I can think to give you advice to achieve a balanced budget position for next year, notwithstanding how difficult it is. I draw your attention to a couple of specific matters in terms of my technicals. Section 4.3 of the report makes clear that although the media focuses on the cuts and the reductions and the savings, I equally want to focus on the net add to budgets and emphasise that part of our problem, as is the case with all local authorities, is the sheer amount of pressures sloshing around in the system. So over the revised medium-term financial plan, we have £135 million forecast to be needed to be invested into services. So even with the focus on savings, there would still be an add in cash terms to directorate budgets of about £80 million over the next 4 years. And that is summarised in my revised table 1. And that's probably where I'm going to focus most of my attention in terms of technical advice this morning. You will be aware that the Welsh Government has indicated it had a tight settlement and had limited choices over what it could deploy money on, and chose to effectively reduce all budgets bar the NHS. The treatment that was special for local government was an ability to maintain the planning assumption from what was a 2-year deal last year, that the average settlement would be 3.1%. We were not surprised to get 3.8%. We anticipated, because of some technical changes, that we'd be one of the authorities that did better than average. But the problem is an awful lot of water has gone under the bridge since that 2-year deal was set last year, and that is clearly indicated in table 1. The council does not control local government pay nor teachers' pay. There were significant increases in local government pay in the current year finally settled. Fortunately, the authority had anticipated and budgeted for the right amount, but we are anticipating up to 5% pay awards for both teachers and local government staff for the coming year, then potentially dropping down a bit as we expect inflation to drop back down. The first major problem area for us is teachers' pay. The settlement agreed at a national level with Welsh Government and the teaching unions was agreed on about the 9th of March after we set last year's budget. And to some extent, there have been some interim arrangements with temporary grants paid in the current year for teachers' pay, but we are now in a position where they all drop out. So you have a massive compounding effect in note 2 of a 22-23 consolidated pay award, a 23-24 pay award, and an expected 24-25 pay award, all of which will be above that headline average 3.1% increase in grant and above even our 3.8% headline. In similar vein, the UK government announced welcome substantial increases to the national living wage and some of our obligations in Wales under the real living wage, particularly in terms of social care compact. And so there are very substantial pressures on especially social care and a number of our other contracted providers, plus our own pay bill. You'll recall that in previous years, the local government pay award has had to be significantly bottom loaded because otherwise local government itself faced struggling to be a national living wage employer and of course aspire to be better than a real living wage employer. So those things start to really compound in terms of the pressures, and why you see a very large pressure in 24-25 and then it dropping down a little bit in future years. In note 6, I have taken a view that I can trim some of the centrally held inflation pots. It did grow significantly in the current year. A reminder, I grew it to about 5 million and then turbocharged it with £15 million worth of energy one-off support. That was never going to be sustainable, and linked to that, and which makes the process complicated, I have to reverse out all of the one-off use of reserves that were propping up our own energy costs in the current year and schools' energy costs. And that's one of the fundamental secondary problems we have in that inflation levels at headline rate may be dropping, but they haven't undone the trebling of energy costs that this authority and all other authorities have faced across the UK. So we have to reverse out that. Note 7 reminds you that there is a borrowing facility at the moment where I've indicated that rates are not advantageous, and because we secured substantial borrowing at below 2%, I am continuing the strategy of advising council to defer any new external borrowing until the end of the medium-term financial plan. But I wanted to provide for it in stepped increases rather than all just suddenly pile in at the end year, albeit it is likely that we will do that final commitment of external borrowing right at the end of the medium-term financial plan, because interest rates at the moment are not advantageous enough for me to give officer advice to suggest that you should externalise any more debt at the moment. You will be aware, as we've discussed at this panel for a number of years, that because we were fortuitously able to secure low interest rates and have some slippage on our capital programme, that I have routinely been reporting a significant in-year underspend on capital financing. And to help balance technically the overall budget, I have given officer advice that recommends that some of that be drawn down one-off in 24-25, because you will be aware those net interest savings are temporary only. Note 8, again, we have had major discussions over the years about the use of the capital equalisation reserve, and I have needed to advise that some of it is drawn in the forthcoming year, with the bulk of it being drawn in 27-28 to neutralise the point at which we will look to potentially externalise that £50 million worth of external new borrowing to be decided at a time when rates are advantageous. The secondary note 8 is important. That is a major factor in terms of the position and the political and officer advice given to schools. Schools will be under undoubted pressure in the coming year, as they will be in all authorities. And the suggestion is that we take the ICT hub reserve in full and offer it in the mix one-off to schools. I have had to give strong officer advice to Cabinet and the same to the School Budget Forum, emphasising the one-off nature of this, and it is designed to give schools a good chance to set budgets for next year, but clearly everyone understands the cliff edge effect that comes the following year. The rest of the table sets out the things you would be more used to seeing in terms of expectations around pressures on individual services and the demography that we face. It indicates how we've deployed that one-off deployment to schools. It continues the commitment to build some additional money into social care over the medium-term financial plan, because that is where demography and pressures are against us, as they are all authorities. And the other matter I draw your attention to in the table is note 14. The contingency fund has routinely in recent years been running at about £3 million. It was increased to £5 million in the current year, and I have again given officer advice that I'm satisfied that it is reasonable to draw it back down to that broadly £3 million level for next year's budget, to try and get a balance right between putting as much into services as possible, whilst buying some time as we see what happens as the national picture settles down. There is another budget due in March. Welsh Government's budget consultation is live until literally end of February, and they will not be making decisions in the Senedd until March. So it probably means it's another funny old year. I keep saying that every time I turn up to Cabinet or committee these days. But what does that mean when you take a step back and look at the bottom of the page? It means my officer advice does not change from the view I gave to council, which was any service that could legitimately set out spending pressures of £2, I felt as an officer, probably we could afford £1. And that is reflected in that table. £50 million worth of pressures, £25 million worth of net funding, £25 million worth of savings. This time, fully equally shared the pain with schools, which is set out later on in the table. It is a difficult settlement. I'm sure the leader will want to comment and others will comment accordingly. You would have to be on a different planet to not be aware that every authority in the land in the UK is struggling with the level of funding. And we remain in a position where our balance sheet position is strong. Our earmarked reserves are really, really strong, and it is appropriate that there is use of those in extremis to buy some time to work through what the overall budget picture means. But it is also the case that it is not sustainable in the longer term. And I also continue to advise that general reserves are at the lowest that I am satisfied with. They have been 10 million now for many, many years. Our budget continues to grow, and it is reasonable to be low on those if earmarked reserves are high. But we are in a position where we're having to do quite a lot of chopping and changing. I'm having to give officer advice to support drawing from reserves for slightly different purposes for which they were first intended. So you're seeing some early draw from capital equalisation reserve. You're seeing some of it being used to defer borrowing to later years. You are seeing the school's ICT hub infrastructure reserve being recommended to be drawn in full immediately to help ameliorate pressures in schools. That should give you a clear signal that there are real pressures in the system for this authority, as there are in all authorities. But it is designed to ultimately boil it down to a budget that enables schools collectively, compared to schools probably in most other authorities, to set budgets that have a chance of balancing and not perilously reducing their overall levels of reserves. Our schools remain not the highest per capita, but joint highest in Wales in terms of opening reserves. The distribution is variable between schools, and many of you will be governors on governing bodies, if not all of you, and you will be concerned for the pressures that individual schools are under. I will continue to be concerned about the pace and scale of draw from earmarked reserves and the amount of things that we're having to do temporarily, taking some balanced risks between reducing some of the central pots to maximise the amount that can go into frontline services and ultimately reduce down the number of posts at risk to the lowest possible number as set out in the report. It means it's at an officer level, it's as inoffensive as I can make it with the resources that have been made available to this council. And I'm sure a very similar pattern and discussion is happening in every authority. We have deliberately not, as I gave advice to Cabinet, not set out a specific headline grabbing number on council tax. Many authorities have. The press have inquired. I continue to give my advice, which is my planning assumption over the medium term plan is an average of 5 in an average year with a range of 3 to 7, and those planning assumptions remain valid as far as I am concerned. But I hasten, no decisions have been taken yet, because to some extent there is a live Welsh Government budget consultation. There is a UK Government new budget in March, and there are some real concerns over what may happen to some of the specific grant proposals at an all Wales level and individually in each authority. So we're trying to keep our options open to some extent, but there may be some questions and interest in those, because it's the sort of thing that the media and the public want to know, but it gives you some steer as to the broad range of proposals that we continue to work within. So I think that's it in terms of the technical advice I need to give at this stage. I am more than happy to take questions when you get to that, but it may well be that the leader wants to come in and indicate some of the wider bits. But I'll be guided by yourself, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Leader.
Thank you, Chair. And thank Mr. Smith and his team for the work that they've done again to pull together what's a really challenging set of numbers, not least because we, as Mr. Smith has said, the settlement from UK government this year through to Welsh government was just a meagre £305 million. That was over a 2-year period. That equates to about 165 million a year, or 169 million a year. We spend more than that on education in Swansea alone, as I've said before. So to expect a national government to support all of its services, health, council, education, and all of those other services on that amount of money is simply unrealistic. So it's inevitable that that's going to create significant pressures. There just isn't enough money in the system. Now, again, we know that there's a UK government budget due in March, and given that we're in an election year, we can all hope that there may be further goodies produced in London that will have a positive impact on Wales. We will see. But even if those do come, they will be too late for this budget round, because we'll already be forced to make a decision as a council by the time that is announced. So, you know, I still am hopeful as the eternal optimist that more money will arrive, and we will continue to lobby Welsh Government that if new money arrives in Wales, we will want a fair share of that in local government to support education and other services. But we can't base our plans on that at the moment, because we can only work on the numbers that are announced. And as I said, they are terrible from UK government at the present time. Turning to the situation in Swansea, if you look through the papers, you'll see we've had around £15.3 million extra this year in terms of the uplift. And of course, within that, of course, so you've also got then that we pay the fire service levy, which we anticipate will be well over £1 million immediately going out the door to fund our contribution towards the fire service. We continue to lobby Welsh Government ministers to remove that levy from the council funding and to treat it as a precept, as we do for the police, because it is diverting money that the taxpayer provides to run services within the council for education, social care and other services into the fire service. I'm not saying the fire service do not deserve to be properly funded, but it shouldn't come from within the council's core budget. It should be something that's allocated separately outside of local government. So again, that we will continue to have to pay that bill, and of course it was well over £1 million last year, and we expect it to be well over £1 million this year. So before we even begin on things like council tax, you're looking at around 1% needing to be raised just to pay the fire service levy. So it is a difficult position. If you look at the table there in terms of our commitments to education, as you know, politically, we've set out for a number of years now that education remains not only our top priority, but our top funding priority. And you'll see an indicative settlement there to schools of some £17 million for this year. Now, do the maths. That means we're giving education and schools more than we're actually receiving from the Welsh Government in terms of money in our settlement. That inevitably means that we are making available some of our reserves, and part of that is to allocate a specific schools reserve directly to schools this year to help them. If schools were receiving the fair share of the money that we got from Welsh Government, that would be about 33% of that 15 million. So they should expect around £4.5 million as a fair share. They're actually getting close to £17 million this year in terms of funding. So nearly over triple. But as Mr. Smith said, given the pressures in that system, given the pay pressures, which are largely unfunded, given the inflationary pressures and other stuff, it still doesn't meet all the pressures in schools, and schools will have to continue to make use of their own reserves in terms of their budget setting. But look across Wales, look at the settlements for schools across Wales, look at what other councils are considering having to do, and the position here remains relatively more generous than it does in the rest of Wales. And that is a mantra for the rest of the budget. We haven't made the final decisions in terms of council tax yet, as Mr. Smith has said. We know that other councils are consulting on council tax rates of up to 10%. Some still may go higher than that. We're certainly not looking at 10% in Swansea. I can give that assurance today. But as Mr. Smith says, we work within a range, as we do every year, in terms of where we think council tax needs to be set. In terms of the overall service savings and budget savings in there, again, what we've tried to do this year, working as a corporate management team through the Cabinet and director colleagues, is to make sure that we try and focus on areas where we can make a saving, but without having an impact on jobs or on posts. Again, you will see that in the papers, around 20 or so jobs, posts are at risk as part of the changes. That is a relatively low number for an exercise of this scale. And again, I can assure you that a number of those posts are already vacant. They are ones where people are not in. And what we will do, as identified in the papers, is to work with heads of service, with unions, to try and ensure that people who may be affected by those savings are helped to find a new role and to migrate. Again, if people wish to make use of the early voluntary severance package, that remains live for them as well as an option. But again, if people want to remain employed, we will do all we can to find them an alternative role within the authority. So I'm confident that we'll avoid compulsory redundancies this year, but I cannot give an absolute guarantee because it comes down to personal choice of the individual. In terms then finally of the proposals themselves, again, you'll have seen councils across Wales going out with a range of suggestions for saving money this year, from closing libraries to moving to monthly refuse collections or black bag collections, to discontinuing some of their core services, to reducing other services to statutory minima. Again, if you look at our proposals, they are largely focused on savings which don't have those sort of impacts. We're certainly not proposing to close libraries or reduce or cut services entirely. Again, it's about part of our transformation programme, trying to refocus some of our services and modernise where we can, but without having detrimental impacts on staffing levels and service levels, and certainly not removing services. So again, try to be as pragmatic and as transformational as possible, given the challenges we've got. But I've been leader now 9 years. Most of those years have seen austerity budgets, from UK down. We've had to live with a regular, challenge of 20 to 25 million having to come out of our budgets every year because of the funding that's been there. And this year is no different. It's for me, it's a return to those austerity budgets that we saw from 2010 onwards. We will continue to do what we can to protect our services locally, but it becomes more and more difficult every year, given that you're working with smaller and smaller resources and the pressures because of inflation, because of the cost of living, because of the energy pressures, are simply huge at the moment, and that makes it all the more difficult. But you know, it's a position that's probably relatively positive compared to the rest of Wales, but is still extremely challenging. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Leader. I have Councillor Peter Black has put questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can I just ask, I want a couple of questions about Table 1, mostly, I think, directed at Ben. First of all, I note in terms of the use of reserve, with the capital equalisation reserve and the other reserves, we're basically taking just under £8.5 million out of reserve. I'm just wondering, what are the other reserves which we're using to for that particular purpose, Ben?
So at present, the only two reserves I'm recommending drawing are the whole of the ICT reserve for schools, which is that 7 million, and the capital equalisation reserve, which is the other £1 million. I'm not proposing at this stage to draw from any other earmarked reserves. You rightly adduce that that's about £8 million draw from reserves, much lower than the current year, where I had to deploy and give officer advice where £20 million was drawn from it, proposed to be drawn from earmarked reserves. And we'll have a discussion about the current year position as the next item, Councillor Black.
Okay. Thank you very much. On the contingency, I think you said you're reducing the contingency to 3 million and you're proposing 2.555 million going into the budget for next year. But you've also got just over, well, nearly 2.5 million and 3 million for successive years. So if the contingency is down to 3 million, where does that money come from? I'm not understanding the position properly on contingency.
So again, we're in the fortunate position that contingency is in practical operation a base budgeted contribution to an earmarked reserve, which is itself called contingency. So prior to this year, we had run it down to about providing for £3 million a year in the base. It had grown to over 5 million because of the sheer number of risks we faced coming into the current year, with the local government pay award unsettled at the point at which we set the budget, with 2 years worth of teachers' pay unsettled. We did effectively increase contingency to over 5 million. So it's not, although it may sounds like it could be a one-off item, it is actually a base provided for item, and that's why you see a draw in all 4 years. It effectively means I'm drawing the base budgeted contribution to contingency for in-year surprises down to around the £3 million mark in all years, under the proposal set out in the table. Peter, Councillor Black.
Yeah, that's great. I understand that. Finally, the last point for now, on the temporary one-off additional funding for schools, you've got £7 million going in there next year, but nothing for subsequent years, which obviously we can't set subsequent years budgets at this stage. But I'm just wondering, does that make that the cliff even steeper in 25-26 when that extra £7 million isn't available?
It does, absolutely and unequivocally, and I've been very frank in the advice I've given to Cabinet, and equally frank in the advice I've given to the School Budget Forum. If, I mean, ordinarily my advice would be you take a reserve. The reserve has got 7,029,000 in it. My preference would be that it's used for the purpose for which it was created in the first place, which is to pay for replacement ICT kit over the next few years, all the way through to 2028, 2030. But there is undoubtedly otherwise going to be a funding difficulty, one could say crisis, for schools, as I'm sure will play out in 21 other authorities across Wales. And therefore, if it's taken all in one go, it does indeed exacerbate the cliff edge the following year. There is frankly no other money left in that reserve. My ordinary advice would be use it for the purpose intended. My second set of advice would be, well, if there's 7 million in there, how about 4.5 million followed by 2.5 million to get a more gradual glide path? But I think it is indicative of the seriousness with which the leader, the Cabinet Member for Education, and their Cabinet colleagues and chief officers, and myself wearing the Section 151 officer hat, felt there was no choice but to, in case of emergency, break cookie jar immediately. It is that serious. I mean, our schools collectively are in a very fortunate position compared to the rest of Wales. It may not feel like it individually when you sit as school governing bodies, but there are two authorities with £20 million in schools reserves at the moment, us and Cardiff. But when you come on to the second and then my update on third quarter budget monitoring, I do anticipate schools collectively needing to draw about £10 million in the current year. So they'd be down to 10. Frankly, without deploying that reserve in full, there would be a real risk that reserves could be significantly close to being exhausted in 24-25. I think the response to turbocharge with one-off money in 24-25 does provide funding protection for schools and does enable them to slow their own draw from reserves, but it undoubtedly is a bit of double or quits the following year. And I was at grave pains to make that clear to head teachers when I met them with the leader, and also at the school budget forum, that it does undoubtedly exacerbate the position. It's not what I would normally advocate, but I think circumstances are so difficult that politicians, head teachers understood why it was necessary to allow that to be proposed as one of the funding options. I think it will play out quite and prove to be quite difficult for a number of authorities and their schools across Wales, Councillor Black.
I've just realised that 7 million and 29 is actually in the table twice. I hadn't realised it was the same sum. Yeah, because you've got it in for use of other reserves and for that. So that's
yes.
I was
Effectively,
getting a bit confused about that. Yeah.
Yeah, apologies.
Yeah.
It's designed to neutralise it over the medium term, so it is at naught, but it shows both the draw from reserves and then the deployment of it all. When you start getting to very large scale draws from reserves, it can make this table very, very clunky. You have the same with the other item where you see the reversal of the previous year's energy draw from reserves. You end up seeing some quite large adjustment figures in there because none of them are affordable in the base. And you know it does make it, I do accept, difficult to follow the trail, but it's both showing the draw from and use of. But the reason we do that is to show that it is fully neutralized and there's no money in the base in future years. So it further confirms your interpretation, which is it creates a cliff edge for schools in 25-26.
Okay, just one last question. Sorry, Chair. Going back to the capital equalisation reserve, obviously we're drawing 1.3 million this year, but then we've got 350 and 5.350. Is that 5.35 the actual where we start getting the changes to the way we've restructured the repayment on capital borrowing? Is that where that kicks in 27-28?
At this stage, not quite for the final year. You're right that there is a tipping point, and to some extent the MRP tipping point has already occurred. But as we've had discussions, I'm sure Councillor Jones will come in a moment. I can see he's indicated what we've had on top is the bonus on capital financing of making 6, 7, 8, 9 million pounds a year of the benefit of having variable interest rates on deposits versus the secured sub 2% borrowing. The reason it is shown the way it is as I've indicated and given consistent advice to Cabinet and Council. At the moment, the administration is undertaking additional capital expenditure of up to £50 million for which we have not yet borrowed the money. So I am anticipating needing to defer it until 27-28 because I will not want to recommend drawing more money from PWLB or other borrowing sources until interest rates are much more advantageous. We are not going to repeat 1.8% for 50 years. It was a steal deal at the time, but we are not going to go out and borrow PWLB money at 5%. So at the moment, I need a device that indicates that the £50 million, which at 3.5% interest rates and MRP would require £3 million a year of revenue costs to cover it. So it's a device for making clear the pressures are in the life of the MTFP and neutralised by a draw from reserves. But the advice I've consistently given to Cabinet and Council is at some point when that £50 million is externalised, there is undoubtedly a cost of new borrowing and it will fall to the revenue account. Decisions will have to be made at the time, whether that is by further increases in council tax or by making adjustments elsewhere in revenue budgets. So it's turbocharged for that reason, Councillor Black. It's inelegant in one sense, but it means I can place on record the liability that the capital strategy that was agreed by Council has committed this Council to at some point in the future. And it's just designed to work the system to be as advantageous as we can be on interest rates. But my strike price, I probably would give advice to Cabinet and Council to borrow again externally at anything below 3.5%. I mean, that's still double what it was at 1.8. We're not going to repeat that, but there is that liability committed to. We haven't yet committed the whole of £50 million worth of new additional borrowing, but you will be aware of a number of reports that have come through to Cabinet and to Council committing to individual items, which means we are on that sort of path where up to that £50 million facility will be needed. And in the very short term, I'm using the capital equalisation reserve and other cashback reserves to draw down on our internal balances effectively. And that's why I have been at great pains to emphasise that whilst we have enjoyed making £7-8 million a year of interest savings compared to budget, it is temporary because we only ever borrowed what we needed to borrow to finance the medium-term capital commitments. So it's more than just the MRP tipping point. Sorry, that's a very long answer on probably the most technical element of the budget. I'm sure Councillor Jones will follow up with his own questions in similar ilk on that, because it's a matter that's been of great concern to him.
Thanks, Ben. I'll pass to Councillor Jones then.
No, I think the leader wishes to interrupt.
Yeah, just on the reserves point that Councillor Black raised, I think, look, it's all very well saying that education is your top priority and it's your top funding priority, but when you get to rainy days like this, you have to come through and protect that service. And, you know, as I've said, it's yes, it is drawing forward the entire IT reserve and deploying it into schools this year, but you know, we're not doing that in the basis of we have no other reserves. Over the last few years, we have tripled the amount of reserves that we hold as an authority. So we are very well provisioned, and we have a very high liquidity rating in terms of the council's finances. So we are in a strong position to deploy reserves. So what I'm going to be really clear on is Councillor Robert Smith and others were not prepared to keep money in a bank whilst teachers were being fired in schools because there wasn't enough money in the system. That's a political choice. Mr. Smith gives us advice as a technical officer, and that is absolutely appropriate. We decided to deploy the entire reserve on the basis that we wanted to ensure job losses in schools were minimised, that teachers were there to teach children, because children don't get a second chance at that year of education. It's different to a road scheme or something where you can do it the following year and there's very little impact really. For education, kids get one chance, so you have to follow through on your commitments. And secondly, just to say, that is going to be a theme of this budget. As I've said, the reason you put reserves in place is to prepare for a rainy day. And as I said at the Cabinet meeting, we're in monsoon season this year because of the scale of the settlement that's come to Wales. We've been absolutely shortchanged by UK government as a nation. There isn't enough money in the system. So therefore, councils like ourselves, where we built up sizable reserves, have to be prepared to use sensibly some reserves to support services through difficult periods.
Yeah, thank you for that. I fully understand the reasoning behind it, but can I take that as a suggestion that you may well find reserves in future years to alleviate the pressure on schools as well?
Absolutely, but we've been very clear with the head teachers in the schools that reserve was there for a purpose, as Mr. Smith said, which is to replace IT in future years. It remains now a challenge as to how we replenish that reserve in order to deliver that IT refreshment a different way, and that will require discussions with schools in future years.
Okay, can I go on to Councillor Jeff Jones?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Mr. Smith, I wasn't going to bring up the MRP, but I'm glad you actually did clarify, you know, that we've perhaps gone through the good times and now we're in the, shall we say, the payback period. As the leader said, you know, I think we have increased our reserves. I think we've had quite good settlements really over the last couple of years, but just really going back to the funding for schools. I know I put a question into council for next council with regards to £8 million. I was under the impression that there were £8 million was taken from the school reserves for 23-24. Now we're actually talking here about 24-25. Now is this 7 million? It's the same as the 8 million we're actually talking about. And it's coming from the hub IT budget. What effect would it actually have on that budget? And if you're actually taking it from the school reserves, how can you call it temporary funding for schools? So I'm a bit confused, shall we say.
So to clarify, you're right, it involves multiple years, but it is slightly better than the way you've inferred it. So for the avoidance of doubt, schools finished the 21-22 year with £28 million in reserves. The £8 million answer to your question, schools unequivocally drew £8 million of their reserves in 22-23, reducing collectively our schools' reserves to just over 20 million. Cardiff and ourselves are the only ones that have got over 20 million in reserves as at the end of March 2023. In the current year, 23-24, the intelligence I have from my officers and schools is that £10 million will need to be drawn from schools' reserves in 23-24. So I anticipate that schools collectively will go from 20 million to 10 million of reserves left at the end of this March 24. The proposal in front of you, and which was put in front of Cabinet, is the ICT Hub Reserve was £7.02 million set aside by council, not from schools, for the purposes of replenishing ICT kit. So that is in addition. It's got nothing to do with the 8 million and the 7 million. They just look conveniently similar. So the £7 million is the council's money that it set aside to replenish the kit for schools' benefit, and has, in partnership with head teachers and the school budget forum, suggested it is the right thing to do to, in case of emergency, break glass fully. So that's the position I anticipate that schools would start 24-25 with about £10 million worth of cumulative reserves. Now, given they've drawn 10 million or anticipate to draw 10 million in the current year, that's the main reason for indicating that a substantial additional sum of money needs to be available to them. But that is not drawn from schools' reserves itself. It is a reserve held for the benefit of schools, but crucially was provided in the good times, as you rightly alluded to. We had 3 years we were able to put substantial amounts of money into reserves, and we prudently put the whole £7 million aside. Instead of trying to save up for it in over 10 years and have it available, we put it all aside in one go. As the leader has indicated, the obligation I have is I still got an obligation under that grant offer to make sure that additional sums are made available to replenish the kit in due course, but we'll worry about that in future years. So for the avoidance of a doubt, it's the council putting in 7 million of its reserves, albeit badged for schools, which are fundamentally different to the nature of the reserves held collectively by schools themselves. So I hope that clarifies the position, Councillor Jones.
Yes, very, very clear. Thanks very much.
Leader?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to add an additional bit of context to that, because when I saw the question that had come in for council, I was a bit perplexed as to where it had come from. But absolutely, unequivocally, we have not taken money off schools from their schools reserved and used them within the central council. That is simply untrue. And as Mr. Smith has said, that hasn't happened. What we have done in consultation with schools over a number of years now is to say that if you look back at 2019, schools reserves were at 8.6 million. They went then to 28 million, as Mr. Smith said, and then during 22-23 they came down to 20 million, and that is schools using the reserves, because of course schools can only hold reserves over 5% if they demonstrate that they've got a robust business plan for the use of those reserves, because that money is intended to reach pupils and children to support their education. It is important that schools reduce their reserves down to a reasonable level, around 5%, which is the guidance, in order to make sure that the money is reaching the children, as I've said. What we've been at it over the last few years, as Mr. Smith alluded to, is that Swansea has been the richest or one of the richest authorities in terms of schools reserves that are being held. Now, that is not helpful for the children who are in the schools, because they're not seeing the benefit of the money, but also it's not helpful for us in discussions with Welsh Government, because Welsh Government will say, well, you seem to have lots of money in schools reserves that you're not deploying. So we've had a very grown-up discussion with schools around making sure the money is released on the projects, on the investment that's required for schools. So you will expect to see schools reserves continue to reduce back down to the guidance level, which is around that 8, 9, 10 million pounds. And that's what Mr. Smith and I have been talking to schools about. But can assure Councillor Jeff Jones that no money has been taken from schools for central purposes. And as Mr. Smith said, we set up that IT reserve centrally, which has now been deployed in full, and we will have to now look at how that is recovered in future years' budgets.
Councillor Mary Jones.
Thank you, Chair. And sorry, I will have to leave just before 11 because I've got another meeting. I'm looking at Appendix B starting on page 33, and it goes like all the way through then about the savings for each department. But as they written there, you can't really tell what's been looked at. I know I ask this probably every year. How can we have the papers to show what's actually underneath it? I mean, if I take the first one on page 33, restructure corporate marketing, fine. But how did you come to that figure, and how are you restructuring the, you know, there's the same with social services, education, they're just headlines. How can we see all the background papers to understand how and who or what it affects? Because it doesn't show you anything at all, and the public can't understand it either. If you just looked and said, restructure digital project management team, fine. Have you got 10 in there and you're thinking of going down to 4? Or, you know, there's nothing tangible in any of the appendices to be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Leader.
Yeah, Chair, this is consistent with previous year's information, and Councillor Jones will appreciate that in some areas, especially where the sums are quite small, they relate potentially to changes of a specific post. So again, it's important for the anonymity of the staff and the posts concerned that we don't provide a level of detail that identifies an individual within the organisation. That would be wholly inappropriate. And again, just to reassure Councillor Jones, in terms of the restructures, if you look through the Appendix B, you'll see a number of items that are linked. And I know the Chair will be aware that we've had discussions cross-party around the level of support for different functions within the council, and that's part of a transformation piece of work that touches upon scrutiny, governance and audit, cabinet, civic office, corporate management team, around the level of support and resourcing that we have across those. And we've had discussions about making sure that that's a sensible level of support and an equitable level of support across all of them. So again, what we didn't want to do, Councillor Jones, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, is to put a level of detail in there that identifies an individual potentially within those sections. So again, it's part of a broader scheme, and I know certainly the Chair and others maybe in their discussions at different venues will have been made aware of the level or the detail of the changes that are going through the transformation programme.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Wendy Fitzgerald. Wendy, you're on mute.
Sorry, it keeps flipping back to mute. We've heard this morning all about the difficulties, the severe financial difficulties that councils across Wales are in, and the fact that the Welsh Government is apparently not getting sufficient monies from Westminster. I appreciate that there are real concerns. However, when it comes to Joe Public, they're going to be inevitably faced again with the council tax rise. And then there are questions. Well, why are we having to pay more council tax when the council has money to splash out on expensive active travel routes, for example? Unwanted, unnecessary, and in my ward, for example, just in my ward, 1.147, almost that amount of money has been spent on an unwanted active travel route. Now, and I think this is where the council has difficulties, because how do we as councillors justify, if you like, a vanity project in the context of the severe financial difficulties that councils are in, and the fact that council tax rises every year? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Wendy. I think who's that? I think we will. The leader will answer that.
Councillor Fitzgerald, you may need to go on mute again, because I think we're getting feedback. Thank you. Lovely. Yeah, I mean, look, I know you. Sorry, you're off mute again. Thank you. That's great. Leave it as it is. That's fantastic. Lovely. No, I know you were a cabinet member for a period of time, so you'll understand the challenges of setting budgets and that the fact that there are different types of money that councils receive. Revenue is where the pressures are. Those are the day-to-day bills that councils pay for the running of services. The scheme you're talking about is a grant-funded scheme, which means that money is only provided for that specific purpose. It cannot be moved to spend on social care or on education. It's provided for the provision of better cycling and walking routes, but also it's capital money. It's one-off money, so it's not. Again, it can't be used to support revenue budgets. So again, it's one of those challenges of how government allocates its money. Ministers rightly elected will decide on post their election what they will deliver for the people of Wales because they were elected as the Welsh Government. They then offer money to councils to deliver schemes within local authorities, and we cannot lawfully vary that money to spend it on other things. What I would say is, when a government gets elected, it does things that people like, it does things that people don't like, but they are the government and they've won the election, they've got the right to spend the money.
Ben Smith.
I wanted to give technical advice on one other matter, given Councillor Fitzgerald has rightly raised that, boil it down to the public and trying to understand what the consequences are of decisions made, and I will deliberately avoid the politics and focus only on the technicals. The settlement is the settlement. The average is a 3.1% increase in revenue support grant. The assumptions that Welsh Government have made around standard spending assessment for individual functions means that they have made an explicit assumption that council tax at standard spending would need to rise by 6.7% across the whole of Wales to stand still. Now, CTSS is not an obligation or meant to be an exact guide, but it was pitched at the level of September CPI. It is indicative of the Welsh Government knowing that there is not enough money in the system for local government because that assumption is made in the settlement. To stand still, we give you 3.1% on average. Councils would need to raise CTSS by 6.7%. And that's why you almost get this inevitability of a need, whatever you decide on individual services, to have to regrettably put up council tax by more than headline inflation. For balance, I would indicate that similar assumptions were made in England around core spending power for individual councils. Yes, there is a cap on authority increases in England, and similarly an assumption was made around 6% in Scotland. So I think there is an explicit acknowledgement in the system that effectively at 3%, council tax are going to have to do more of the heavy lifting, and that's why you've got the range of figures that the leader quoted that other authorities are facing. I would echo what he has said on the other matter, which is our focus at the moment is on our core settlement, which is revenue. And yes, there are a whole raft of things that are capital and a whole raft of things that are subject to specific grant. And it's something I mentioned in my first lot of technical advice. One of the things that concerns officers and members is the uncertainty, given the lateness of the settlement, again, that we don't know what some of these specific grants are going to be for. But as the leader has indicated, some specific grants may only be spent on specific projects and may result in £1 million spent on something that you quite rightly, Councillor Fitzgerald, say, well, that wouldn't be a priority for XY member of the public. It is one of the unfortunate natures of specific versus block grants, and whilst local government's position is we'd like as much to be in block grant as possible so that we can actually take local choices. But I thought it was worth me putting in the mix the matter around council tax and the planning assumptions that Welsh Government and other administrations have made around the level of council tax. It does go to the core of one of the issues that when it comes to the media and the public, all we ever see is talk about reductions and yet an inevitability of council tax increases. The system is almost forcing councils into that position, not only in Wales, but across Scotland and England too. So I thought it was appropriate for me to draw attention to the assumptions Welsh Government has made quite explicitly in its overall settlement, acknowledging there ain't enough money in the system.
Thank you, Ben. Are there any other members of questions? No. Well, can I go through a couple of things then? First of all, on table 1, Ben, there's a few issues. There's on item 4, note 4, there'll be no increase in pension costs this year and next year, but there will be in years 26, 27, 27, 28. Is that because of an actuarial examination, or is it something other than that?
So it is merely an assumption at the moment. There will be another triennial revaluation of the pension fund, and I have reverted to assuming the broadly 1% increases will resume again. You will recall the last triennial revaluation that resulted in the base position for last year was one of the very fortunate things we were able to do to offset a number of the pressures. So it is designed to be the next triennial revaluation. You know, we were fully funded at the last revaluation. Performance has dipped a bit for some councils since then, so there will be a new revaluation, but it's a planning assumption, and I've reverted to my long run planning assumption of a 1% per annum pressures, but there is no certainty there will be them. If we are fully funded again, there may be no increase. If we're overfunded, there may be a reduction. If we're short, there will be an increase, but I've reverted to my longer run planning assumptions on that. But you're absolutely right to assume it's linked to the next revaluation formally by the actuary.
Right, and the also applies to item note 5, where there's no increase in the teachers' pension costs. I'm assuming again that's an actual actuarial figure that we've been given, or an assumption that the pension costs are covered elsewhere.
So that one's an interesting one for two reasons. Teachers are subjected to a quadrennial revaluation, so there will be no quadrennial revaluation in the 4-year period, but there is a revaluation at the moment, and one of the pressures that is sitting in the system is the current teachers' pension contribution rate for employers is 23.68%. It will rise to 28.68% from the 1st of April. It adds a £5 million pressure into the system. It has been delayed by the Government Actuaries Department, but is now confirmed as the rate, and sitting in the mix in the autumn budget statement was several £billion held back until spring of 2024. So there is a huge slug of money due to fund all schools in England, and this is one that definitively does have a Barnett consequential and will see money come over to the Welsh Government, and it is referenced in the funding assumption for schools where we have assumed we're getting £5 million in 24-25. That's the reason then it drops out at 0 for the following 4 years, because there isn't another 4-yearly valuation until the next year of the medium-term financial plan. The complicating factor is here we are making discussions. Now, I'm making an assumption that overall it will be broadly neutral and work out A-OK, but here we are at this point in time with a cost certain falling on schools, because it is now cost certain at 5%. And I did reflect it in last year's medium-term financial plan. I knew it was coming, and it is good that there is to be a Barnett consequential and good that there is to be funding. But it would be nice to know what it is, given it's a very, very large sum of money. And we do not know whether it will come as block grant or specific grant, nor exactly the timing. But there is a reason why that one's in there. So I'm confident there'll be no further actuarial revaluation affecting teachers over the life of the next MTFP. But there is unusually a very large slug of money. My assumption is about £5 million for schools in Swansea alone, which is currently sitting off in the ether, but is coming definitively on the 1st of April. We will know more probably as a result of the March budget statement by UK government, and then it will be a Barnett consequential to Welsh government, and then there will be a need for the money to come over. If I were to hazard a guess, it is most likely to come as a specific grant for 24-25, and then go into block grant in 25-26, because frankly, the UK budget is so relatively late in the day, we will probably already have just sat in council and made a decision on what our budget is for 24-25. It's just another one that's a messy irritant. I'm confident overall it will work out all right on the night, but I would have preferred, given it's been delayed already a year, to have had some greater cost certainty and some certainty as to how the money was going to find its way in. But this is one, given commitments that have been made at a UK and Welsh government level, I would be staggered if this one wasn't ultimately flowing all the way through. It's just at this point in time, I don't know how it's going to flow and what exactly the figure's going to be. But our schools need to budget now. And at the moment, I've factored in that full 5% increase and assumed the money is turning up in time for 1st of April. But I would have preferred to have known it with certainty. Thank you.
Councillor White, you put your hand up. Is it
Yes,
to
thanks,
do with
Chair.
this
Yeah,
item?
if I could, yes, please. No, yes. It relates to energy inflation prices. Page 18.511. Clearly, the additional money there of 4.5 million is going obviously to be transferred to place, which I believe obviously covers the main frontline services that we provide, which the public have really look to have for us, and that's very welcome, because these are the main frontline services, that are out there on a day-to-day basis. And in regards to the one with schools, how Mr. Smith, perhaps can explain with the leader, how will that be sort of worked out? Because we have lots of schools that perhaps are a lot older than others. To what the new ones have been built under the 21st schools program. So how will that be calculated? Are you able to advise on that, either Mr. Smith or the leader?
Mr. Smith, want to go first, perhaps?
Yes, so I'll go first, and you'll have noted that it is a one-off offer for schools again, because in the current year I gave schools, I gave advice to Cabinet, which gave council the decision making to give a £6 million one-off to schools. There was never any guarantee it was going to continue. Rates have come down that we pay on wholesale rates, and so my judgment is that £4.5 million is a reasonable offer. At the moment, it is fully built in, albeit on a one-off basis, into the school's quantum, whereas it was set and held centrally and then allocated in year. The decision on allocating it to schools is a matter for consultation with the School Budget Forum and whether it sits in the formula or without, and that's the point at which I'll probably defer to the leader. If it's in the quantum, the majority of the quantum is delegated to schools on a formula basis, and that is probably where education colleagues would prefer it to be allocated. But the leader and I, as you've rightly referred to, Councillor White, is our schools are in varying degrees of energy efficiency and condition and age, and is something that may be of some further debate. But at the moment, for the avoidance of doubt, I have put the full quantum into the school's delegated budget, and I would therefore expect the majority of it to be driven by formula. It is a difference of approach to last year, where all energy costs were held centrally because we weren't certain as to the sums, and that was about £12 million for ourselves and schools, and an offer for third-party partners. At the moment, it is £4.5 million to place and £4.5 million one-off only to schools, and I must emphasise again the one-off nature. It was an extension of a one-off offer for a second year to schools. But I don't know if the leader wants to comment further, but I think we all recognise that schools are different in terms of age structure and energy efficiency, but we are also bound to some extent by consultation and decisions taken by the School Budget Forum and the School Finance Group as to how schools are funded on a broadly formula basis.
Leader, would you like to make a brief statement?
Yeah, just to add to what Mr. Smith said, I think what Councillor White has identified is absolutely right. We know, we talked about reserves recently, reserves are not held equally across the school's estate, and similarly, as Councillor White has said, we have different different age of buildings, different level of energy efficiency in our buildings, and therefore different pressures on energy bills and others. So it is a discussion we've started with Education, Councillor White. The first challenge was to make sure we could deploy sufficient resources to try and help with the pressures in schools. The second part of the challenge is making sure as best we can that the formula for allocation makes sure that the extra additional investment reaches where the pressures are within the school's estate. That is a real challenge. It's not easy because obviously schools are not static bodies. Their pupil numbers change. You will see different pressures coming in year to year. So it is a challenge for education officers to make sure that the money is allocated on the most equitable and fair basis, and it is a complex system. But certainly we've raised the principle of ensuring any extra help goes to where it's most needed.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
Can I go back to the table one? On note 6, where you have a change in the inflation provision, where you've taken out 1.6 million, and then the following year you've added in 2.4 million. is that because inflation has dropped from a figure, and you've removed that figure and you've added it into the school's budget? Ben?
So I've not directly added additional money into the school's budget, but I remind you that in the current year, because of uncertainties, I grew the central inflation provision to around £5 million and turbocharged it with another £15 million one-off for energy. So the energy one being taken out, one-off funded into schools and put in the base for place means that £15 million drops out in full. I have taken a view that by retaining a contingency sum and looking to maximise the amount that goes into all frontline services, not specifically just schools, Chair, that I could safely draw that sum down and still retain a central inflation held pot of over £3 million. But in line with all previous MTFP assumptions, I always make an assumption about there being future inflation pressures. The way we build cash limits these days is that because the money is so tight, other than pay awards and exceptional cost pressures, I routinely build an assumption around central inflation and hold it centrally for deployment in year. So that's the only reason that in future years it goes up. I have judiciously given an officer advice that it is safe to take some of it in the forthcoming year purely to maximise the amount that is deployed into services above the line rather than in Bank of Benland's pot below the line. When we come on to the second quarter in due course, you will be aware in previous years we've balanced service pressures above the line by drawing down on central sums. So it's again a judicious view as to what is safe to take while still retaining a central sum. The amount isn't that large when you think about, yes, inflation, headline inflation may drop down to a couple of percentage points, but one of the real pressures all councils face is that is simply not the inflation pressure faced, particularly in social care provision, when you think about the sector is predominantly low waged, and therefore, as welcome as it is that national commitments are made to increase real living wage, national living wage by 10%, there are real pressures built in. So you see a mix where we try to build some of it into key pressure points like the commitment to put more money into social care, but that's why it's an unusual one where you see future pressures building, but also in a couple of cases where I've had to say it is reasonable to trim my central pots and maximise the amount that Cabinet could recommend for consultation to be spent on frontline services.
What I find unusual is that the following year is 2.4, but then it goes up to nearly 5. So it's an accumulation
It's cumulative,
of the 2.5.
correct, Chair. It is.
Okay. Can I then move on to where are we now? Item 13, which is medium-term financial plan service pressures accepted and new service pressures. There is no difference in that, is there not?
No, effectively not. One reflects existing assumptions made in the MTFP, and we refresh it. And going back to Councillor Fitzgerald's point, at this early stage of consultant, in the same way that there is a limit on the amount of detail that is set out in the medium-term financial planning assumptions, the specific pressures and who gets what comes in the February and March budget setting, when one of the appendices appended is the individual cost centres for each area where you can see where the money is flowing through. That's in line with normal practice, but you're right, effectively there's no distinction between the two. It's just that one lot was already built in, and then it's the refresh of the new lot of pressures that we've priced in as we've recognised the latest pressures, again predominantly in social care, but there are also substantial pressures in waste services that I'm aware of. And what we do is we go out and collectively ask all heads of service to put a whole raft of budget proposals forward, but for the avoidance of doubt, given how little is in the system, in reality any pressures that are accepted ultimately then have to be balanced off by the £25 million savings ask in terms of process. There's not enough to actually technically fund them. They might be accepted, but there isn't enough money to fund all of the demands placed upon the sort of central treasury function, as it were, Chair.
Okay. Can I move on then to table 4, capital allocation, and the rhetoric that comes above it? Sorry, in 4.10, the current and future progress, clear and present time future support. If generally capital supported borrowing is likely to be significantly curtailed. Any different from last year and the years previous, or is this an assumption for the ongoing capital allocation? Or
So this again is one of those ones that I indicated and gave advice to Cabinet last week. The basic capital allocation was advised as going up £30,000 on 12 million. Welsh Government have identified an error in their allocation, and the good news I was able to advise Cabinet was that the £30,000 uplift was actually a £61,000 uplift. But that's still on a £12 million basic capital allocation in the core settlement. So I still maintain that is very, very curtailed when you've got inflationary pressures of 10, 15, 20% on individual schemes that this panel is well aware of. And also the core allocation is very, very minimal compared to the overall capital programme, which includes all of those specific capital grant schemes, like including the active travel items that were talked about previously, where there are specific grant offers, often for millions. And also the council's own choice of heavy lifting in terms of unsupported borrowing and its own capital programme, set in the context of a capital programme that is routinely closer to 200 million. Okay, it might only spend 100 million, and we'll come on to that, I'm sure, when we come to the slippage in the second and third quarter. But it just shows how relatively little is in that basic capital allocation. And whilst I did caution Cabinet to not get too carried away and excited about the figure having doubled, it having increased by not 30,000 but 61,000 does, I think, give clear evidence it is likely to be very, very severely constrained. And unfortunately, it is a planning assumption, and I continue to assume it will be very severely constrained going forward. The bulk of capital will be specific grant schemes or decisions made by each council as to how much it can afford to provide from its own borrowing plans and how much it makes them and values the trade-off between revenue and capital. That becomes much harder as the outlook for the official position on a UK-wide basis in terms of the autumn budget statement, and therefore the envelope the Welsh Government is working within, that the revenue outlook looks equally very constrained for a number of years, which does make it harder to make a decision to put more into capital. But I remain of the view that capital will be constrained in terms of support from both UK and Welsh Government, as unfortunately at the moment the outlook is the same for revenue going forward. But there are a number of matters that may change that position. I think most commentators, including myself, do not really believe the credibility of some of the planning assumptions set out at a UK-wide level. But as the leader indicated earlier, I can only work with what is officially on the record and assumptions flowing from that. And I am therefore taking a view that there is very, very constrained capital support going forward, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. The only other thing I do is like say to the leader and yourselves, and to the cabinet as well. Last year we had a change in the budget process, whereas at council meeting when we set the budget, there was a change in the pre-scrutiny of the budget. I hope that we don't have that again. I hope that we have a chance to scrutinise the budget before the actual budget is set at the council meeting, and I hope the leader is listening to that. So any sudden changes on the day of the budget are not going to be appreciated, for the fact that we need to scrutinise the budget to follow our own our own standing orders. Thank you all for that, and we'll move on to the next item, if that's okay. And the next item is the Revenue and Capital Budget Monitoring Report, Quarter 2, 23-24. Leader, do you wish to say anything on this?
Nothing on this. I'll leave this one to Mr. Smith.
Okay, then Ben.
So again, I will be relatively brief in terms of my technical advice. The second quarter indicates an overspend position, an overspend of a residual around £7 to £8 million, materially down on the first quarter at nearer to £13 million from services, partly driven by my advice in terms of drawing down central pots from inflation and contingency. And there is a commitment from cabinet members and chief officers to get back to a fully balanced position by year end. That is incredibly important, because everything we've just discussed is on the basis that we must rebalance the current year, given the relatively low level of general reserves. The important table is the appendix, which sets out the planning assumptions for the rest of the year. I remind you the budget was set on the basis of a £20 million draw from reserves, predominantly to fund the energy costs. And given the level of overspending forecast at second quarter, the residual amount showing is nearer a £30 million draw from reserves. And I would add into that because of the special nature of schools reserves, as I alluded to earlier, I expect up to £10 million to be drawn from schools reserves as well. It is crucial that directors and cabinet members assist me in rebalancing the position for the authority as a whole for this year. Otherwise, it does destabilise the assumptions to be made in the budget going forward. We are still in the fortunate position that we have large earmarked reserves, and I've given advice as to how to deploy some of them. And we're in the fortunate position that I did have sums in contingency and in central inflation to deploy against the risks this council faces. You will see in the report I have also made an officer technical assessment as your accounting officer and your statutory advisor that there is a need in accounting terms to make a substantial provision in this year. I would emphasise no claims have been made, but the budget monitoring is a forecast of the position at the year end, and I have given technical officer advice, which I'm pleased Cabinet has accepted, which has resulted in a very significant provision charged to the accounts, which has required me to equally give advice to redirect the normally assumed underspend on capital financing, and therefore it would not be added to capital equalisation reserve in the current year. There may be some interest in this matter, but this is only around the accounting technicals at this stage. I am in receipt of legally privileged advice, and it is also commercially sensitive for the authority, and so I may be limited in how much discussion I'm able to give today, but it is right and proper that it is recognised in the assumed budgetary position. We have been in the fortunate position. The technical advice I've given in the past, which has resulted in an add of over £100 million to reserves, was gratefully received by council. The technical advice I gave, which enabled millions to be saved each year on capital financing, was gratefully received by council. And the advice to set up the capital equalisation reserve was gratefully received by council, all of which have added to our immense firepower and our protection and insulation from some of the ravages that are facing all public bodies and local authorities at the moment. There are occasions when I have to give technical advice that goes the other way. This report clearly identifies one of those in terms of a technical provision having been made. It is my view that that will still need to be made in the current year, and that is why it is reflected on the public record in public discussion, but I must emphasise that elements of it are likely to be prejudicial and commercially sensitive, and it may be more appropriate for the discussion and debate at another time on those. I don't wish to curtail the debate on it, but it is right and appropriate. I recognise that there is a trade-off between the public interest, recognising the overall pressures, and what is at the moment an accounting technicality only. What it means is some of the earmarked reserves have been reclassified in anticipation of year end into a provision. It makes it harder to deploy them because it's provided for a specific purpose, but to all other intents and purposes, whether it was a provision or an earmarked reserve, it is fully cash backed and is available in the short term to assist the council in protecting its overall interests as we go through a very, very difficult point in time. That is the main reason for driving us to a position where we are overspent at this point in time. You have been used to me coming and reporting an overall underspend, notwithstanding service overspends, enough central pots to result in an overall underspend. At the moment, at second quarter, there is a clear overspend which must be fully rebalanced. I have individual assurances from my fellow directors and recovery plans that they are making inroads to that. I do anticipate third quarter, which crucially will be considered by Cabinet at the same time as it considers its more detailed proposals to Council for setting the budget, that there will be further inroads. However, it is extremely unlikely that they will be fully covered at the end of February, and I do expect to have to go all the way through to the end of the year to try and rebalance the position. So there is some material items in there which are of a technical nature, driven by accounting standards and protocols at this stage, which I have factored in, and my strong officer advice to Cabinet and ultimately to Council as a whole is whilst they're not nice things to have to put in terms of assumptions about what we might need to spend, sometimes you can't just have just the good times. Sometimes you have to have some bad times, and there is an assumption about a specific cost in there that may at some future point come, and it is indicative of me not being prepared to take any risks whatsoever with the authority's finances. By being prudent and setting it aside now, we remain adequately provisioned and reserved for all foreseeable risks for the medium term, and it is that as a whole that has enabled me to strike a relatively calm tone in terms of the advice I've given today on the preceding item, and my relatively calm position in terms of the advice to council in December, where yes, times are difficult going forward, but if you appropriately and rightly provision for all things that could come to pass, it leaves you in the best possible place to accommodate surprises should they turn up. Councils that fail to consider that technical advice and then are surprised when things turn up can end up not having enough resources to deploy. So I think that's the important bit in terms of the messaging. I am confident that cabinet members and chief officers will deliver a balanced budget for the current year and therefore avoid any risk of a draw from general reserves, because I simply can't allow there to be a draw from general reserves. They are at the minimum I've certified for 7 years on the trot. But it does mean the authority remains very well provisioned for all foreseeable risks, and it is the prudent thing to do. I think that's all I need to give in terms of technical advice, Chair.
Leader.
Chair, thank you, and thanks to Mr. Smith again for the clear advice there. I think certainly on the provision element, if members wish to seek more detail on that, I think, as Mr. Smith suggested, given the commercial sensitivity around that, it's probably better done in closed session. That's the advice from Mr. Smith, so I think we should heed that. But generally, I was going to say, look, I mean, for those of you who've done this process several times, you know that we start the year usually in an overspend position, and that usually comes down to a balanced or surplus position at the end of the year. I see no difference, as Mr. Smith has outlined, why we shouldn't achieve that this year. I want to place on record my thanks to all of the directors and cabinet members for the work they're doing to ensure we achieve that. And just on the reserves position again, you know, in terms of the energy reserve, as Mr. Smith alluded to, it's important to differentiate between actions we proactively take to set up a specific reserve and then deploy it to help schools and others deal with what's an energy spike at the present time. That's gone out not just to schools, obviously, but to care homes and to community centres, because all of those are facing really big shocks in terms of their energy bills. That is different to having to run to reserves in an unplanned way because you've suddenly discovered a shortfall. So again, it's a difference in terms of how you do it. And again, in that context, that's why I'm saying this year, there will be planned use of reserves in order for us to take some of the stuff that we set aside and deploy it to help people through those difficult times.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think we should have a in-camera session at some stage to get a proper briefing on that particular issue. I've just got a question in relation to the report itself. Apart from that, on page 56, we're looking at an overspend of nearly 2.3 million pounds on school transport costs, and I understand we have statutory responsibilities with that, and in a sense, a lot of this overspend is outside our control. It just seems to me that we are facing increasing costs in school transport on a sort of haphazard way because of the way it pans out. I'm just wondering whether there's any review of how we can better meet the demands on school transport and how we can meet those statutory responsibilities in a way which will hopefully minimise these sort of increases in future, maybe get better value for money.
Leader.
Yeah, there's multi-pronged approach to this one. So there's various elements. There's the home to school transport element. There's the general school transport. I mean, look, one of the challenges at the moment, we operate within a deregulated bus market where councils like ourselves, because we didn't have legacy bus services that were prevented from running them, the bus bill is due to come out in the summer. And again, I've been clear that we're going to take an opportunity in that to look at what we can do to either control or run services ourselves. So there's a real opportunity there. I know schools are already looking at utilising their minibuses that they have to provide transport to those who currently receive home to school transport. There's been some pilots running which have been pretty interesting in terms of delivering a service at a lower cost. The other aspect of it, of course, is we have a heavy reliance in terms of use of taxi services, which are very expensive currently. So again, if we can use school vehicles in lieu of taxis where that's appropriate, that can help bring down the costs as well. So we're looking at a range of how we reuse other vehicles that we have, both within the schools and council estate, how we can look at running services ourselves once we have the powers to do so, and substituting different models within that service to try and bring down costs. I think the biggest driver, Mr. Smith will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the biggest driver within that figure at the present time has been the increase in fuel costs that have driven that up. So that's the biggest. It's another energy spike consequence. But again, even taking that out, there are some elements of home to school transport which are incredibly expensive, and therefore we need to look at, is there a better way of delivering that safe service to get people back and forth to schools?
I mean, we had a discussion about this in a recent governing body meeting, and I think the problem with the use of school minibuses is you're relying on volunteer teachers. There's a cost in terms of training people up and, of course, maintaining the bus themselves. So in a sense, that seems to be an ideal solution. If just the teacher goes sick, you find yourself without that transport solution. So I think there needs to be maybe a more sustainable solution in terms of that. But I think I agree with you in terms of fuel costs. That's a major contributor, but also the taxi costs and the cost of escorts, where we can maybe start to share and maybe coordinate transport, that might help to bring the cost down as well.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Okay, Ben Smith.
So yes, just to follow on from what the leader has said, yes, it is the drivers of fuel costs and then the pressures on operators. But to link it back to the previous item, it's one of the reasons why I've also maintained a central inflation provision, and I have very specifically provided for additional cost pressures in home to school transport centrally at the moment for next year, recognising that whatever reviews take place in terms of trying to remodel all options over transport operations, and whether it's done at a local level in schools and the pressures that individual operators face, I have prudently made sums set aside to recognise it will take time for there to be inroads to the cost pressures. But you're absolutely right, both of you, that the pressures are yet another energy spike, and it is another line of defence, and one of the reasons why I'm holding quite a still significant sum in central inflation and not deploying it out into the service at the moment, because I think, in my view, in the very short term, is those cost pressures will continue to abound, regrettably, albeit fuel costs have come down a little bit. There are still undoubtedly pressures in that part of the system.
Okay, thank you. I think the idea of a closed session for the discussion of the equal pay provision is a good idea, and I think we will put that as soon as possible we can, because I think many people thought this was all and done with. So I think that we will program that in as soon as possible. Any more questions? If not, I'll move on to the next item, which is the performance court, item 8 on the agenda, which is, can I thank you, Leader, for your attendance today? Okay, thank you. And the attendance of Mr. Richard Ewell. Okay, item 8 is the Q2 performance monitoring report, and it's Mr. Richard Rowlands, sorry.
Thank you, Chair.
I know that Councillor David Hopkins has sent his apologies, and you're all on your own, I'm afraid.
Okay, no worries. Thank you, Chair. So this report, it sets out performance for the second quarter of the year, meeting the council's key priorities as they've been described in the corporate plan. As you can see in paragraphs 2.1 and 2.2 on page 62, this is a new format performance report that is more comprehensive And what it tries to do is to bring together both the qualitative and quantitative information in a more rounded way to try and better describe progress meeting our wellbeing objectives that are set out in the corporate plan. So that involves bringing together the progress meeting the steps in the corporate plan, the success measures, the performance data, and the corporate risks, with an overall evaluation provided by the chief executive, which builds on the individual assessments for each wellbeing objective provided by the lead directors and heads of service. So just looking very quickly at the Q2 report itself in Appendix A, which you can see starting on page 67, there is an overarching assessment of performance at Q2, which is provided by the chief executive. And then starting on the next page, we have each of the corporate objectives in turn, starting with the safeguarding people from harm objective, where we have an overall assessment of performance against this objective provided by the Director of Social Services on page 68. And then on pages 69 and 70, there's an update on each of the steps in the corporate plan to meet the safeguarding objective. And then on page 71, an update against the success measures for safeguarding included in the corporate plan. Then the corporate performance indicators on page 72, and then finally the corporate safeguarding risk on page 73. And then this format is repeated in the rest of the report for each of the corporate objectives in turn. So that's the structure of the new report. Just take you back briefly to the pie charts in the covering report, which you can see starting on page 62 in paragraph 2.3. So those pie charts provide a summary of performance at Q2, which shows that the majority of items were on track during the second quarter. And then if we look at paragraphs 2.3.1 on page 64, that highlights some of the key areas of achievement during Q2. And then finally in paragraph 2.3.2 on pages 64 and 65, they show the main areas as at Q2 where further improvements are needed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Richard. I have to say, the layout of this covering report is very good, very clear, and actually it does give a lot of information in a very confined and very constructive way. I think it's a far better setup, and I congratulate whoever's done it, because it does highlight the performances. Yeah, it's good. Thank you very much. Are there any questions for any members? Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. There's a lot of detail in this, so I think we could spend all day going through this bit by bit. But what stood out for me in terms of the performance indicators, and it was in social services, which is, well, my page numbers don't seem to marry up with Richard's. On page 72, I think, the performance indicators there, the number of visits, percentage of visits to children on the child protection register, which were not overdue, is in the red. Target is 90%, and the actual is 74.42. And then on the next page, corporate risk for the safeguarding priority, all the rags are in red on that. So that is obviously a matter of concern. And I wonder whether we might want to, as part of the letter, as a result, is try to get some information as to what exactly is going wrong there, and where we and what action is being taken to put that right. Unless Richard can answer that question, which I doubt very much.
I don't think you can answer that, Richard. As well briefed as you are, I don't think you can answer that one. Okay, any other questions? Anybody else? No? Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, sat here for quite a bit of time. Okay, it's Steve, over to you.
should know by now. Yeah, so good morning, everyone. Invited here this morning just to give an update on the destination management plan for Swansea, which covers the period 2023 to 2026 and was approved by Cabinet in October last year. And the report sets out the progress that we made in updating the previous plan and getting to a stage now where we've consulted with businesses and stakeholders locally as to the priorities really for our focus over the coming period. So in terms of a brief recap, you know, the report is there and hopefully you've had a chance to see it. The destination management plan is what we think is aptly titled Back on Track, because we feel there's a sense of focus, understanding and confidence with the tourism sector that we've been engaging with over the last few years, and therefore Back on Track seems appropriate as far as they're concerned. And I think as far as everyone's concerned post-pandemic, really, that we're getting back to doing what we do best. The destination management plan is a document that Welsh Government have generally insisted upon, local authorities have. You know, we've produced a number of them in-house, and to do that we've had to produce a number of pieces of research to inform that over the last couple of years. For those of you who don't know the figures, you know, we do as a destination encourage and receive about 4.2 million visitors. You know, these are figures that are, you know, following on from Richard's performance indicator monitoring chart there. You know, one of the key performance indicators that we do report to council in terms of the numbers of people visiting the area. You know, the destination management plan uses that data along with 3 other pieces of research that we conducted in 2022, which included a visitor survey and a survey of businesses to help inform what the priorities are. And clearly 2.2 in the report identifies what those strategic priorities are for the industry, not just us as a council. You know, we have a major part to play in delivering the visitor experience, but, you know, we are working alongside businesses and other stakeholders in order to do that. And those strategic priorities haven't really altered over the years. They still very much about trying to improve the quality of the destination, trying to make sure it's a year-round industry in that it's supporting both the economic and you know, environmental sustainability, and also that we continue to work in partnerships not only with businesses and the sector, but also, you know, government bodies, and equally as important, you know, internal departments within the Place Directorate, which ultimately has the you know, a huge responsibility in terms of maintaining the landscape, but also encouraging investment and also providing the facilities that, you know, that visitors come to expect when they visit a destination on holiday. So in terms of those priorities, we wanted to break them down into both actions and impacts and ultimately outcomes, which which reflect what the corporate plan is looking for, but also other documents and strategies within the council. They are all part of this bigger picture, really, which is taking place. And I think we all welcome the amount of investment that's happening at the moment and is planned over the next couple of years. And, you know, the report identifies where, you know, that intervention has happened with completed projects, you know, some really significant ones in terms of, you know, what's happened at the arena with the you know, the building of that facility, but also then some of the other infrastructure improvements that are taking place across Swansea, which enables us to, you know, continue to reach out to visitors and say that the product and the reasons to visit Swansea are changing. And of course, all the, you know, the stuff that's in development as well. You know, we've got a huge program of work that's underway, you know, that we're either delivering ourselves directly, working with third parties, or working with other organizations and the private sector to deliver. So, you know, there's plenty to remain optimistic about, and, you know, that's kind of underpinned then by the research then in the report 2.4 onwards, which gives a general breakdown of the population, we are a city, we are a relatively small city, so to receive 4.2 million visitors does come with the benefits then in terms of making sure that it keeps people in employment. You know, and that is evident certainly in the accommodation sector, where we outperform pretty much most of Wales in terms of hotel room occupancy. The hotels in the city, albeit there's, you know, perhaps not as many, but their average occupancy and their monthly occupancy exceeds certainly the Wales average. In terms of another piece of work that we undertook was to establish how many bed spaces there are. You know, that's important in terms of, you know, knowing who's out there. And that's kind of broken down then with the bed stock figures. And then also the value of tourism. You know, I did say it was about 4.2 million visitors, and, you know, nearly 1.5 million of those are stay-in. So it's important that we understand, you know, that split between day visitors and the stay-in visitor market. And for the first time in 2022, that exceeded the £500 million mark in terms of financial contribution to the local economy. That's the local economy at large. So it is direct spend to attractions, hotels, guest houses, restaurants, cafes, but also things like transport and also things like shops, retail, because, you know, we do try to encourage visitors to spend money locally. So in terms of those visitors, we did a survey. It's probably one of the most comprehensive visitor surveys that we've ever undertaken. It ran from March, April time to around September, October, in order to get a good feel in terms of what visitor characteristics are during that period, but also then what they felt about their destination when they came, because that was important in order to inform, you know, other services, other bodies in the areas of improvement that were required. Some of the key facts from that visitor survey are highlighted there in an infographic, just to make life a little bit easier for us all. But I suppose the most pertinent one is that, you know, that bottom right hand corner, that 96% of people who visited would recommend Swansea to, you know, anybody to follow up on that. And also 99% of those who did come also said that their stay was very, very enjoyable. So, you know, we're obviously doing something right, both ourselves and private sector partners, but it isn't just about, you know, reflecting on past glories. You know, there is some changing and some challenging times. Many of those, you know, we've heard about the, you know, demands on people's spend, and, you know, people making tough decisions as to whether to go on holiday or whether to, you know, to make improvements to their properties, or you know, the general cost of living really is making people think twice about how they prioritize their spend. Tourism trade survey. So we went out to businesses. We were particularly pleased with this because I don't know whether it was just timing, having come out of COVID, but we don't usually get a great response from businesses when we reach out to them. But we had a particularly favourable response in terms of the numbers of businesses who provided feedback, and they gave us a real insight in terms of what the priorities are in terms of support from the council that they needed, but also for them moving forward. How optimistic were they for the future? Where do they think, you know, their priorities lie? And, you know, that's helped inform the plan as well. The third piece of research that we did during 2022 was the hotel demand study. And I know this has probably been reported previously, but essentially it was a piece of work that we had commissioned to enable us to inform future inward investment inquiries from potential hotel operators, but also some of the existing sites that we're looking to market at the moment. And again, another really positive piece of independent research that came back from industry specialists in terms of the main sort of headlines from the survey, where, you know, coupled with interviews with hotel managers locally, general managers, they also were able to tap into some of the industry statistics that are available to them, which businesses, you know, provide on a weekly, monthly basis. So essentially, the summary of that was that Swansea needed more hotels. We certainly, with the amount of demand and the amount of people visiting the city, we weren't keeping pace with that, with the amount of hotels that we needed to provide. So they certainly have indicated strongly that we need at least another 3 hotels across the city to meet that demand. And, you know, again, we've provided that in infographic form just to highlight the key findings of that. And that's another significant piece of work that we undertook in 2023. It was the sort of tail end of 22, and then the report was published in 2023. So that's kind of given us the picture behind the scenes in terms of what businesses were saying, what visitors were saying, and where our priorities needed to be in the future. And then we also did a summary then of the marketing activity, because essentially we're only a small team of 4 people, 4 members of staff, 2 of which do the marketing, one of which my colleague Geraldine alongside me does that engagement with trade, tries to understand their business requirements. And also then we've got one other member of staff supporting the team. But our marketing is very much focused around those priorities in terms of seasonality. We don't generally do a lot of marketing during the summer because we know people are going to come anyway. Our aim is very much to make sure that businesses feel that there is a market coming through in that spring, autumn, winter shoulder period, so that, you know, that's when the majority of our marketing activity will take place. And certainly during the COVID period, you know, we've tried to focus a lot of our campaign activity on real reasons to visit, and that's based on the sort of visitor research that we've had. You know, our campaigns have ultimately been about growing our audience base, getting more people to sign up to emails in the future, because that's a good way of encouraging the visit, getting them to follow us on social media channels. Our social media following has increased significantly, introducing and keeping up to date with the trends around things like TikTok and the growth in Instagram, and more people signing up and registering with YouTube. We've got our own YouTube channel now of all the videos that we've produced over the years, and just making sure with the resources that we've got that we're in places where the markets that we know are coming to Swansea from, that we have that presence, not only on social media, but some of the high profile things that we do on some of the main transport networks. And contained within the report as well as some of those examples that you'll see, both in terms of PR, the coverage that we've got in attracting journalists, vloggers and bloggers down to the area, but also then some of the evidence there of the presence that we have in the main transport hubs as well. One of the new things for this year is our inclusion of the work of the events team, because we recognise how important events are to visitors around planning their stay. They like to know what's going on, and we have a fairly robust event programme, either that we're putting on ourselves, some of the calendar events like the Wales Air Show, you know, Outdoor Theatre, Oystermouth, Swansea Bay 10K, but also some of the events that we enable to happen as well. Some of the, you know, the concerts in the park, and we've already announced one for this year, which is James Arthur, and we're looking to put on a weekend of concerts, which will enable people then to plan around that. But, you know, we recognise that events not only attract visitors, but, you know, that enables us to, you know, package things as well. So, you know, come down to the air show, not just for the Saturday or the Sunday, but stay the weekend and explore some of the wider area. So that section is new for this year's destination management plan. And how that all fits in, it's important that, you know, we recognise that in the hierarchy of things, what we do at a local level in tourism is reflected in terms of the national aspirations with Visit Wales and their priorities, but ultimately it's a corporate priority within the corporate plan. And the best one that we align to really is the fact that what we do from a tourism, marketing, investment, events portfolio perspective is it helps towards transforming our economy and infrastructure. And that's the one that, you know, that the team will constantly strive towards contributing towards. Ultimately, it's about numbers. It is about people coming into the area, and it is about spend. Perhaps the numbers of people isn't as important as it perhaps once was. We've got good numbers of people coming out through, you know, a good spread of the year, but we do need them to spend more. What the research is telling us is that people are making tough decisions on how much they spend when they come on holiday, and therefore, you know, the fact that we're working with so many more businesses now is that we're giving them more reasons to visit, and therefore more reasons to part with their money and spend locally. In terms of you know, how we're going to deliver this plan, we continue to you know, work with within the framework of other working groups and other departments to make sure that tourism either appears on their agenda or is certainly a key part of the model for delivery within those working groups. And we will continue with the governance model in terms of reporting to a steering group, which is chaired by the cabinet member, and which is made up of colleagues from within Place Directorate, but also representatives from Visit Wales, and most importantly from the private sector locally, who continue to sit at that group and receive you know, the reports of progress. In terms of progress and what that might look like, ultimately, yes, we do want people to spend more money when they come and stay locally. So working with even more businesses now in 2024 is going to be, you know, advantageous in terms of the product that we can promote, but also, you know, the businesses now, we're not just working typically with hotels, guest houses and attractions, more and more, you know, coffee shops, restaurants, bars, you know, the entertainment industry per se, you know, we're working more and more with, and that success will hopefully yield in higher occupancy figures for both the stay-in market, but also, you know, more spend within retail and our partners generally that we continue to work with. So looking forward, I think, you know, we've identified that, you know, we've seen a lot of changes over the last couple of years. There's certainly plenty more on the horizon, and we've come to recognise that, you know, a big part of the regeneration programme that's happening across Swansea, there's a big visitor market implication in all of those in terms of the capital projects that are being built. And, you know, we hope that, you know, they will add to the, you know, the increasing numbers of reasons why people visit Swansea between this period 2023 and 2026. And we're particularly pleased with the partners that we continue to work with, and we've had some sort of short responses from them in terms of the work that we've done with them, or the optimism that they feel for their own business and for the destination moving forward. And you know, that in summary is the destination management plan that we look to deliver now over the next 2 and a bit years.
Thanks, Steve. Now, members' questions. Councillor Peter Black.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Can I first of all congratulate you on the format of this report? It's very readable and easy to understand, and it's a model, I think, for other officers in other departments, but don't say I told you that. Just quick looking at the visitor survey, I was quite surprised actually in terms of where the visitors come from, because my recollection from the 80s and 90s, we seemed to get a lot more visitors from the West Midlands in those days. And nowadays, we seem to be mostly coming from the rest of Wales, which presumably indicates day visitors and people coming to use the arena and the various venues going here. I'm just wondering if we had so many visitors from the West Midlands in the past, maybe we should be directing marketing to get them back here, or maybe the COVID has actually impacted on that particular issue. But the main issue that came from the visitor survey for me was the issue around public toilets. It's highlighted in the visitor survey, and it's also highlighted in the trade survey. I'm just wondering how this is fed back to the relevant departments and the political process to ensure that we try to address that for the future.
Yeah. Apologies. Still can't get it right. Yeah, so the first point on the Midlands, it's still a market that's still important to Wales, and in particular us. Prior to this report, you know, we did quite a lot of work in the Midlands when the football team were in the Premier League, because, you know, we recognise that's a fairly close market in which to reach out to. It's still on our radar in marketing terms, so we still will do stuff in and around Birmingham. Okay, so we haven't, you know, severed all ties with our good friends in the Midlands. With
2,000 fans went to the Birmingham match.
Yes, well, went the other way, didn't they? Yeah, so
exactly.
Probably good ambassadors for us as well while they were up there. But yeah, you know, it is and will continue to be one of the core markets for Swansea and for Wales. With regards to toilet strategy, yeah, and it features in that box where the visitors say, we're not performing very well, and it's very, very important to us that, you know, the toilet provision is improved. So much so that as Place Directorate, there is a public toilet strategy working group. And I won't say Geraldine sits on that group, but Geraldine is our representative on that group. And, you know, we are looking at how we improve the provision. And I think, wherever you went in Wales, people will complain about the toilets. And I think, you know, that's, you know, there are probably standards that we are across Wales that we're failing to meet. But I think in Swansea, the general provision is okay. It can be improved. I know, you know, the introduction and improvements to some toilets are often the good work of colleagues in other departments is almost undone with some antisocial behaviour that takes place in there, and the general treatment of them, which isn't helpful, particularly when you've got that use of both visitors and residents requiring them. But we are members of the toilet strategy working group, and within that we are looking at how we can improve. We have got 2 new changing places facilities at Nabrock and Rossilly. So in addition to the general toilet provision, we've also got these new changing places facilities, which, you know, on the back of what we've got in Caswell, mean that we've got a much better provision of that side of it as well. So
yeah, I think the issue with toilet provision is most probably signposting. I mean, when you've got 73% of your visitors are basically here to camp or use caravans. I mean, they're obviously looking for public toilets more than say people who are in catering accommodation. But clearly, I know, you know, obviously there are 2 very good toilet provisions in the quadrant. But are these signposts so people who come to the city know where to look for them? And certainly Mumbles has a good provision. I know, as you say, the city. So it may well just be signposting is the issue. But you're absolutely right, because I know there were a lot more toilets in the 80s and 90s, all of which ended up being closed because they were being vandalised all the time, and we just couldn't afford to keep them up. But I think maybe we need to look at signposting the toilets better. Might help.
And we have reopened the ones in the marina as well. You know, they've recently reopened. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. Councillor James.
Thanks, Chair. You mentioned about advertising local events, the major events, because visitors want to know what's on so they can join in and fix what dates they want to book to visit. Is there a facility for advertising the smaller local events, such as the Gower Show, the village carnivals? Because I know that campers particularly, and those in caravans, really enjoy coming to the carnivals. So is there such a facility that these events can also be advertised?
Yeah, so previously the provision would have been, I suppose the go-to document would have been the what's on that you would have seen in most restaurants, cafes, but that ceased just before COVID. What we've tried to do now is to create an online version of that, and visitswanseabay.com is a shared prosperity funded project now that we are currently in the early stages of procurement to develop a new website which will have a greater events presence on it. It will enable local event organisers to add their event free of charge, and it will enable us to then promote those events both to a resident audience and visitors as well. The plan for this development of this website will be over the next few months, and you know, we're hoping that it will be procured, built, and launched in the autumn 2024. In the meantime, what we're doing, the existing site is still there. We're still reaching out to event organisers. They can still add their events free. The site is still a little bit clunky, and that's why we are, looking to develop a new website over the course of the coming months. But we're locally as well, certainly within the city centre, as part of some of the other shared prosperity funded projects, we are looking to increase the opportunities for some of the smaller operators, perhaps with smaller budgets, who still revert to the more traditional forms of marketing, to have a presence locally as well. So that will enable some of the, the sort of cultural arts, music venues to have a space within the local street scene, which could be, some of the poster sites that you traditionally see in big cities. So slightly shorter midterm, a greater online presence, but in the short term, looking at how we can perhaps promote, certainly to a resident audience, some of the opportunities that events bring locally as well.
Thank you.
Okay,
What did you say the website was called, please?
It's visitswanseabay.com.
Thank you.
So that's traditionally been the website that we've used to market the destination.
Okay, thanks very much.
Councillor Susan Jones.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say what a positive report, Steve. It's really heartening to see so much happening with the tourism industry in Swansea. I was away over the New Year and spoke to somebody from West Midlands who was raving about the beach house in Swansea. So our advertising is getting out. My question is, can I have a copy of this report, a hard copy, to put in the local library? We've got so many negative the city you think that Swansea is doing so badly, and this really is a very positive outlook for Swansea.
Yeah, certainly, Councillor Jones. We'll and thank you for your kind words. We'll if they were being entertained in the beach house, then we're clearly attracting the right type of visitor, because
Somebody with plenty of money,
yeah,
anyway.
they've got a good disposable income. But with regards to the report, yeah, we can certainly make that available to you. And well, as you're one of your local constituents, I'll take it upon myself to drop a copy into the library for you.
There we are, Steve.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, Councillor Mike White.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Steve, for the comprehensive report. Can I just ask, when we do the marketing, how well is a special feature within our information regarding our blue flag beaches and green flag parks? Are they a feature within the advertising scope that we use that we send out, or
Yes.
the people can look at?
Yes, certainly, Councillor White. And one of the things that I actually chair the Beaches Working Group, which is we've got an action plan in that to make sure, firstly, that we maintain our blue flag status moving forward, because one, it is a key performance indicator, but also it's another reason why people visit the area. The visitor survey indicated our natural beauty, our landscape, our beaches is one of the reasons that we visit. So there's a linkage there in terms of the destination management plan and the Beaches Working Group to make sure that we maintain the standards in our blue flag beaches to continue to achieve those awards, but also as well that our beaches pretty much feature on the vast majority of our marketing activity. So recognizing, what our visitors said in the past survey, if unsurprisingly, although, it still comes as a bit of a shock to us, there are certain people that still don't know where Swansea is. And that's our mantra, really, that we continue to say where we are. And, we lead on imagery, the striking imagery that we've got, that our coastline and our, the Wales Coast Path, our countryside, our parks, they all play such an important part in attracting people to the area, but also to residents as well. It's important that, residents, our residents utilize those facilities particularly this time of year, and that's pretty much been the focus of what our campaign is for January and February. It's about our well-being. It's about encouraging people to go out to our networks of cycle paths, footpaths, our beaches, and get out there in the countryside and get some fresh air and, you know, some of the things that will hopefully improve their mental health and their well-being. Well, it's dry. I think after the couple of weeks that we've had, it's dry. So
Thank you, Mike. Councillor Mark Tribe.
Good morning, all. Thanks, Steve. A couple of issues. It's more or less to do around street names and signage. Talking to the people who do visit the area that I am aware of, the street names around the city centre, they're either absent, damaged, or ineligible due to the condition of them, dirty, most of them. And the other one concern I have is it's litter, not just around the SA1 area, but citywide. It's pretty awful out there at the moment. And I have to pay my respects to Councillor Wendy Fitzgerald, who I saw on Sunday afternoon, doing a bit on litter picking on the Pentlegate area. But street signage certainly is an issue, and the litter, particularly around SA1, is pretty awful at the moment. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Mark. I think you're making a note. Steve is making a note of that now. Okay, any other member? Oh, Councillor Mike?
Yes. Yes, what I was going to say was, first of all, the way you've set this up and the graphics are excellent. They're really good. And the only thing I would like to see in the future is the number of people staying in hotels in Swansea is actually quite small. And it'd be very good if that figure was increased because it's better for the local economy. And apart from that, it's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you know, we all recognise that our hotel provision, and the report highlighted that is that we need more hotels, and perhaps we don't necessarily need more hotels at the same standard as well. Although, you know, a lot of the hotel operators now operate brands, so the star grading system is almost secondary really to people's decision making. What we need now is a few more of those national, international brands in Swansea to help elevate our sort of awareness really amongst the marketplace, because not forgetting these hotels do a good job as well in marketing the area. They want to fill rooms on the weekend as well, so they will actively reach out to their mailing lists and say, you know, come to Swansea this weekend because there's an event taking place, or, you know, you can walk the Gower Coast Path, or you've got businesses that are, you know, that are new, appealing. We've got attractions operating, or even, you know, what we do find as well with colleagues from Neath Port Talbot that side, people will stay in Swansea and use it as a base for exploring the wider area as well over a wider period. So, you know, there's lots of different reasons why people stay, but ultimately we do need more hotels to attract, you know, more staying visitors.
Any other members? No. Steve, I have to say, and congratulate you on the report. I think the layout is excellent, and I think it's actually encouraging to see one as good as this in the council. I'll be bluntly honest with you, because some of them have been good. This reminds me of the Bay strategy that we had back in 2004, which was arguably the best document we've had for Swansea Bay and for tourism. There are a couple of things in it which I was surprised to see. The self-catering one on the visitor survey, the self-catering and the caravans didn't come above hotels, which surprised me a bit, considering we have some big caravan. I know we don't, compared to Pembroke, we haven't got anything like that, the size of the caravan parks, but I was a bit surprised at that. I was also surprised, not surprised about people not knowing where Swansea was. When we did the exercise with Swansea Futures, and we had the the Watch Company did a survey in London and in Birmingham and asked where Swansea was. I think out of half a dozen surveys, possibly 20 or 30% knew where it was. The others had no idea. But that changed actually when we went into the Premier Division, and 80% then knew. So there is something about football being an advertising medium as opposed to anything else. But the toilet one I know is a major issue, and one that I know private companies we encouraged to actually take a grant, a Welsh Government grant, to actually pay for. The trade survey was also very interesting, and the one I liked, the bit I liked about the operational confidence in the regional offer of our beaches and what have you. It's no wonder it's that high when you consider the quality of the beaches that we do have. The one thing I say about the hotel survey is, if you go to Pembroke, they haven't got a multitude of large hotels, but they got a lot of small boutique and high quality hotels. And that's the difference. We had Langland Court, we had the Langland Bay, we had Caswell Bay, they all went. Now, those are the type of hotels that are prominent down in Pembroke and in parts of Cardigan, and they're the ones, and in North Wales in some respects, they're the ones that actually get a lot of custom. So I think that's the one thing we haven't got. If we had more Morgans or types of hotels, that's the type of thing. The other thing is that there's very little in here about children. I know they not spend a lot of money, but their parents do. And I think there's very little in there about that. And there's very little in there about the fact that we are the only city in the UK that's got 7 castles, one for every day of the week. And it's a unique selling point. But overall, I've got to say, it's an extremely good report. And as Councillor Sue Jones said, who is your local councillor, it is a very, very positive report, and one that we should be very grateful of. Thank you very much. And thank all the staff as well. Okay, can we then move on to item 10? We don't, you've been bored to death enough, so I think it's fair for us to say thank you very much. And if you want to go, more than welcome to go. The next item is item 10, which is the work plan. Has anybody got any questions or comments on that? The meeting 9, which is in February, is the pre-decision scrutiny on the cabinet report on the annual budget. The comment I made to the leader at the end of the meeting was the fact that I hope there'll be no changes on the morning of the budget, because that way it can't be scrutinised properly. But apart from that, are there any other comments regarding the work plan?
Perhaps we can have the equal pay closed session then as well.
Well, that's what we'll try and get it for the February the 8th. I wasn't aware, to be perfectly honest with you, that we had issues with that. Still had issues with it.
That came up in a previous scrutiny, I think, but we hadn't quite worked out the quantity.
Exactly. So we'll have to do that. Okay. If that's the case, thank you all very much indeed for your attendance. As I say, we're now going to have a chat with our colleagues from Neath and Port Talbot. If any of you want to stay online, you're more than welcome.